Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast. Whether you are a sales professional, not in sales, but interested in helping people solve problems, or a founder CEO who is looking to grow your business, you'll find practical tools, stories, and experience you can apply to your role. I'm your host, Jody Mayberry, and with me is Mike Simmons, the co-founder of Catalyst Sale. Hello, Mike.
Hello, Jody. How are you doing?
I am fantastic. Mike and I have done a couple of past episodes about common questions we get at Catalyst Sale. I want to continue that series. We've got a lot of questions about the sales process. So, Mike, what I'm going to do is take all of those questions. I'm not going to ask them from a single individual. I'm not even going to ask a specific question. We just have got enough where I know people want to hear about the sales process. So when people think of the sales process, what are some ideas or thoughts you have or misconceptions people have about the sales process?
Yeah, when I think of sales process, I go directly to our sales process, which is, and we've talked about this a couple of different times on the podcast, but it's that validation could I see the potential of us potentially having some kind of business relationship, qualification, the who, what, why, where, when, how, that's all that discovery stuff, the real meat in this story. Fit, which is based on everything I understand about the customer, can we solve their problem? Does our solution fit? Feasibility, if we can solve their problem, can they actually implement it successfully? Can they pay for it? Do they have the technical resources in place? Do they have the whatever, but can they execute? And then we move to proposal, which is where we build that story out, deliver it in the context of what's important to the customer, clarify what the process looks like, set expectations, and ideally move to a point where we get a closed-won contract, which is our close. And then the last step is that confirmation step, which down the road we go back and we say, did we do what we said we were going to do? So that's usually where we'll ask for that referral. But that's what comes to mind for me when it comes to sales process. What's kind of interesting, though, is I hear a lot of people talk about sales process in the context of buyer journey, in the context of how the buyer goes through the process of making a decision. I also hear a lot of people talk about this process as it relates to what I might think of as more of this top of funnel marketing activity where a lead comes in, they discover the organization, they go through this process of engaging in content, they move through a couple of different steps. So I think there's some confusion out there. Not actually, confusion might be the wrong word. I think there are some different perspectives of what the sales process is and what that means. And a lot of it is skewed or biased based on your individual role in an organization.
Do you think that most organizations have a mapped out sales process? You shared the Catalyst Sale one with us. Do most organizations use something like this?
I don't know about most. I don't think so. I think there are some people inside the organization who might say, yeah, this is our sales process. Or there might be stages that are built into a CRM implementation, and they use that for forecasting and predictability. But when you go through the organization and you ask them to define each of those stages of the sales process, you might find that everybody has their own perspective of what each of those things is. And when you hear that disconnect in perspective of what each of those stages mean, or how you defined each of those stages, or what the expectations are around how people make the decision, or how we guide folks through that decision-making process, I think that's where things can kind of inconsistencies occur and things can start to fall apart. So if you're looking to improve predictability in your forecasting and you're looking to gather better data and take action based on the insights that you capture from that data, you should have a defined process. And that defined process should be easily defined and communicated across the organization. It should just be understood.
Well, and it also seems that if you don't have a defined process, it's also trickier to understand where the customer is in the process.
Yeah. And Jody, I think sometimes we make the mistake of applying our process to the customer. The process is, in my mind, when we talk about the Catalyst sale process, that's an internal tool. It's an internal set of guideposts. It's an internal set of definitions that we use to manage and set expectations inside the organization or across your customer base, or in a way that we use to create forecasting. Like our forecast when an opportunity is completely qualified is 25%. Once we move through that fit piece, we go to 50%, and feasibility, we move to 60%. So and those numbers change depending on the organization we're working with and the organizations that we've been a part of. But that's our internal piece. On the customer side, there's this journey that they go through when they make a decision. And you can think about any time that you've gone through buying something, depending on the level of risk that you might take on, the number of people that are impacted by it, the overall cost, the pain that you're feeling, your buying journey, your process that you go through in order to make a purchase decision is going to change. Like if I'm buying something for myself, it's a little bit different than if I'm buying something for our family, or if I'm buying something that is going to sit in the living room. If it's going to sit in the living room and everybody's got to walk by it, I need to make sure the family's on board, or at least Jen's on board with whatever that purchase is. And that happens in B2B as well. When we're buying a new technology, or we're delivering a new learning management system inside an organization, we're buying access to a subscription library, we're doing these things, we're purchasing from a B2B perspective on behalf of others. And ideally, that's going to be used inside the organization properly. And there's going to be some kind of journey that I'm going to go through, this transition, this period that I'm going to go through that's going to help me decide, is it time to make the purchase? And we've talked about this a couple of times before in the context of the story brand framework and looking at the sales professional as the guide, as opposed to how many folks kind of look at it. They try to become the hero. And there really can only be one hero in that story, and it should be your customer.
Well, talk to us a little more about that. You did mention early on that people confuse the buyer journey and the sales process. So can you give us more clarification so we know there is a clear difference, and this is why you shouldn't confuse the two?
Yeah. So, and I think that Liz touched on this briefly too in a recent episode that we had with her. And Liz is the author of Selling Without Selling Your Soul. And if you haven't listened to that episode, there'll be a link in the show notes. And I'd recommend going back and listening to it. And I'd recommend picking up the book as well. But a rep who's gone through the process of closing business should be able to break apart all of the components that led to that closed business and the decisions that the client made on their end, and then put that back together in a relatively linear path, because you may be moving forward, or you're maybe moving, but you've got to go through a given step before you make it to the next step. So it's going to be linear, but sometimes you can go backwards and then to move forward again as you go through this decision process. But an example that I think might be clear for a lot of folks out here is some people will talk about the demo as being part of their sales process. The demo really shouldn't be a stage in a sales process. The demo might be the way that you share the information in context with the potential prospect. The demo is something that they need to see in order to help make their decision. But sometimes, and I would expect that this happens, sometimes there are going to be organizations or people who may purchase whatever that thing is without actually trying it, without actually seeing the demo. That might happen. Think of a B2C transaction where someone purchases a license when they just look at the top line information about what the product is supposed to do, but they didn't actually go through the process of either signing up for a trial or going through a demo. So when we talk about buyer journey, or when I talk about buyer journey, I think of it in the context of how does a bill become a law? And if you go way back into the Schoolhouse Rock days, you'll remember those videos, but it's how do you get this ordinary bill on Capitol Hill to move all the way through the process of becoming a law? And there's this transition that it has to go through. Well, that transition that your customers go through is going to be very personal for you. And you're going to evolve and iterate your perspective of that over time based on the experiences you have. But you should be able to design backward from any sale that you've closed recently and do this a couple of times, and some patterns are going to emerge. You're going to see that there's a point in time where the customer was engaging in your product or your service where they didn't actually engage with you directly. Maybe they were doing some of their own exploratory type things. You may see a point in time where it's important for a customer to get feedback from others. So they engage with others. They ask people their opinion about this. They want to know how it applied. You may see a point in time where your customer wants to see the solution in action. You may see a point in time where the customer describes what that solution might look like inside your organization. Again, you know your business better than I do. You should be able to design backwards based on your experience.
Okay. And since I didn't ask a direct question about the sales process, I want to make sure we cover enough points on this. What are some of the mistakes that you see either individuals or organizations make in the sales process?
Yeah, in the sales process, I think that's the big one is skipping steps. And the most common one we see is the, hey, I've got a live one. I validated that the person could be a potential customer and they asked for pricing. So I jumped straight to proposal and I started providing pricing. And I did this before I did all the other work beforehand, meaning I didn't ask a couple of important questions like, why is this important? What problems are you trying to solve? How are you addressing this problem that we know that other organizations like you are running into? So they move from validation to proposal without going through the steps of qualifying, gathering the customer story, checking to see if they actually have a solution. And if you find yourself having to write multiple proposals or deliver multiple quotes into organizations, you likely are running into this challenge where you're moving right from validation into proposal. And I would say that's one of the most common ones. A second one that comes up often, and they'll look at a sales process like ours where we have 7 different stages, and we use those stages as guideposts. And they help us with communicating internally, and they help us with general predictability. But many people will say, well, 7 steps, that's just way too many. And they want to cut things out. So they might cut out fit and feasibility, or they go right from qualification into proposal. Well, you've missed, in our mind or my mind, you've missed some important things. You've missed that if-then statement to determine, if I can solve the problem, then will you be able to pay for it or will you be able to implement it? So I think those are the 2 most common is they skip ahead or jump ahead of steps just because they think they see something that may not be reality. And then the other one from an organization perspective is they try to reduce the number of steps, which creates some challenges with predictability and forecast downstream.
I should also mention that early in the Catalyst Sale podcast, like within the first 20 episodes, we did a series of podcast episodes about the Catalyst Sales process. And this Mike it was a long time ago. It was fun to do. But now looking back, I think, gosh, we're so much better together doing this show than we were back then. I'm sure those episodes are still full of wonderful information, though.
I hope so. Like we've talked about, the playbook isn't too deep. Sometimes we overcomplicate this stuff. And when we overcomplicate it, we add additional layers or additional steps, and it creates complexity and lack of predictability. So yeah, I think if you go back and you listen to those episodes, and they're organized, and we'll include links in the show notes to each of those, but they're organized in a way where the process, at least the process that we've adopted and that we promote and that we coach and train to, should be easy to go through and easy to understand. I think the other thing I'm going to do, and I'll include a link in the show notes to this as well as an image, but an image that shows the difference between the process and the buyer journey, and have those overlaid from each other so that you can see, in the process, you may go back a couple of steps. The process isn't linear. It's an evolving thing. But in the buyer journey, that should always be a linear component, meaning if you don't go through a given step, there should be some level of risk. And maybe through your questions, you can guide a customer to go through that step.
All right. We covered the sales process driven by questions that people send in. If you have a question you would like Mike to address on the show, we want to hear it. Mike, how can we get a question to you?
Hey, there's a couple of ways. We're pretty active on Twitter. So Simmons_M or @CatalystSale. Those are 2 of the Twitter accounts. You can also go to catalystsale.com and connect with us directly on live chat. Any live chat goes directly into our Slack instance, and we're able to communicate with folks there. Depending on time of day, we may be a little bit slower. You can also send us an email at hello at catalystsale.com. And if you can't connect with us that way, another way to connect with us directly is you can send me a text message at 480-772-7448, and I'll respond to it. I don't usually pick up my phone if I don't recognize the phone number. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're cold calling out. It's important to deliver context in those messages, but 480-772-7448 is my mobile number.
Well, that's a generous and bold move, Mike.
Hey, as Virgil said, fortune favors the bold, right?
Well, there we go. Well, if you enjoy this show, we would appreciate it if you would take just a moment and leave a rating and review on iTunes. That's a great place to do it. Stitcher Radio, you can also do it there. It's just a great way to show you enjoy the work going on here. It will help other people discover the show. And this is my favorite part. It puts Mike Simmons in a great mood.
It definitely puts me in a great mood.
All right. Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you for listening to the Catalyst Sale Podcast.